My name is Eleanor, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived long enough to learn that love can cut deeper than any knife, especially when it's wielded by those you've given your whole heart to. But nothing in all my years prepared me for the moment my daughter-in-law, Claire, looked me in the eyes and called me useless. "You've been useless since Dad died," she said, her voice cold and sharp, like she'd been holding those words for months, waiting for the perfect moment to let them fly. My son Michael stood just behind her, his gaze glued to the floor, his silence louder than her words. That moment, standing in the kitchen of the home I built with my late husband Robert, felt like the ground beneath me had given way, leaving me to fall through the ruins of the life I thought I knew. I was a wife for 42 years, a mother for 38, and a grandmother for 12. Robert and I raised Michael in this house, a modest 2-story with a wide, creaking porch, in a small town where neighbors wave from their front yards and the air smells of pine in the summer. Robert was the kind of man who'd spend his Saturday fixing a stranger's gate, no questions asked, and I was the woman who'd stay up late sewing costumes for Michael's school plays, even when my fingers ached. We weren't wealthy, not in money, but in love, in purpose, in the quiet joy of building something together. When Robert passed 3 years ago, a heart attack stealing him in the night, a piece of me went with him. I still reach for him in the mornings, expecting to hear his off-key whistle from the garage. But I kept going because that's what you do when the world takes someone you love. You carry on for the ones still here. Michael and Claire moved in a year after Robert's death. They said it was to help me to fill the house with life again. I believed them. I opened my doors, my arms, my heart to them, and their 2 children, my grandchildren, Lily and Ben. I welcomed their mess, their noise, their laughter. I cooked hearty dinners, folded their laundry, read bedtime stories to Lily and Ben until my voice grew hoarse. I thought we were a family weaving ourselves together after the tear of Robert's loss. But I was wrong, and the truth crept in slowly like shadows stretching across a room at dusk. It started with small things, so small I barely noticed at first. Claire would sigh when I left a mug in the sink as if I hadn't scrubbed thousands of dishes in my life. She'd rearrange my furniture without asking, saying it was more practical her way. Michael stopped asking how I was, stopped looking me in the eye. He'd come home from work, kiss Claire, tousle the kids' hair, and pass me like I was part of the wallpaper. I told myself it was stress. Michael runs a hardware store, the one Robert and I helped him start with a loan we never expected back. Claire stays home with the kids, and I know that's a heavy load. So I tried harder. I made myself useful. I stopped sitting in Robert's old leather armchair because Claire said it didn't match her new throw pillows. I stopped playing my radio in the kitchen because she said the music gave her headaches. I made myself smaller, quieter, hoping they'd see I was still here, still me, still worth something. But that day in the kitchen, everything shattered. It was a Saturday, one of those crisp autumn mornings where the sunlight spills golden through the trees and the air smells of leaves and memory. I'd been up since dawn baking pumpkin bread for the kids, using the recipe my mother passed down, the one Lily always begged for. The kitchen was warm flour dusting the counter, and I was humming an old tune Robert used to love, lost in the rhythm of mixing batter. Claire walked in her heels, clicking on the hardwood. She looked at the counter at me in my faded apron, and her face twisted like she'd tasted something sour. "Why are you always underfoot?" she said, her voice low but biting. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but her eyes were hard, unyielding. "You don't do anything useful anymore, Eleanor. You just take up space. You've been useless since Dad died." The words hit like a blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The wooden spoon slipped in my hand, and I stood there frozen, the hum of the oven, the only sound in the room. But it was Michael's silence that broke me. He was there, leaning against the doorway, his broad shoulders slumped, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I waited for him to speak, to say something. Anything to tell Claire she was wrong, to remind her I was his mother, the woman who'd rocked him through fevers, who'd cheered at every baseball game, who'd given him everything. But he didn't. He just looked away, his jaw tight, like I was a stranger he didn't owe a word to. I don't know what I said. Something soft, something like, "I'm sorry you feel that way." My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. I untied my apron, laid it carefully on the counter, and walked out of the kitchen. My legs felt unsteady, but I made it up the stairs to my bedroom, the guest room now, because Claire had claimed the master suite. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wallpaper Robert and I had hung 30 years ago. It was faded, curling at the edges, but I could still see us in that moment, laughing paint smeared on our faces, dreaming of the life we'd build here. I didn't cry, not then. I wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a hollow ache settled in my chest, like a part of me had been scooped out and discarded. I'd lost Robert, and now I was losing Michael, Lily, Ben, my family, my home. I thought about my life, the decades I'd spent building this house, this family, only to be told I was useless. I thought about Robert, how he'd always said I was the strongest person he knew. "You're the heart of this place, Ellie," he'd say, his calloused hand over mine. "You hold us all together. But who holds you together when the ones you love turn their backs?" That night, I lay awake, the house alive with sounds that no longer felt like mine. Claire's laughter drifted up from the living room, bright and careless. The kids' footsteps pattered down the hall, their voices high and happy. Michael's low murmur joined them, warm in a way he never was with me anymore. This was my house, but it wasn't my home. I thought about leaving, just packing a bag and walking away. But where does a 68-year-old woman go when her family doesn't want her? I felt old, invisible, like I was fading into the shadows of my own life. I saw myself in the mirror across the room, my gray hair pulled back my face, lined with years of love and loss, and I wondered when I'd stopped mattering. But deep down beneath the ache, something stirred a flicker, faint but stubborn. It wasn't loud or fierce, not yet. It was quiet, like the first spark of a fire that could grow if you gave it air. Anger. Not the kind that shouts or breaks things, but the kind that simmers, that whispers, "You are more than this." I thought of Robert again, of the way he'd look at me when I doubted myself, his eyes steady and sure. "You're Eleanor," he'd say. "There's nothing you can't do." I wasn't sure what that meant anymore, not in this house, not with Claire's words echoing in my head. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to let her words define me. I was Eleanor Roberts' wife, Michael's mother, Lily, and Ben's grandmother. I had built this life brick by brick, and I wasn't done living it. I didn't have a plan, not yet. I didn't know how to fight a wound this deep or how to reclaim a place in a family that seemed to have forgotten me. But that spark, that quiet anger, it was enough to keep me here, in this bed, in this house, for one more day. And sometimes, one more day is all you need to start. The days after Claire's words felt like walking through fog, everything blurred, heavy, and cold. I woke each morning in the guest room, the one with the sagging mattress and the window that stuck, and I'd lie there listening to the house wake up without me. The kids' laughter, Claire's sharp instructions, Michael's footsteps heading out the door. They were the sounds of a family, but not mine. Not anymore. I'd always been the one to start the coffee, to set out plates for breakfast to hum as I moved through the kitchen. Now I stayed in my room until the house was quiet, until Claire had taken the kids to school and Michael was gone to the hardware store. I didn't want to be in the way. I didn't want to hear that word again, useless. I started avoiding the kitchen altogether. I'd slip downstairs when no one was home, make a sandwich, and eat it standing over the sink like a guest in my own house. The pumpkin bread I'd baked that day sat untouched on the counter, the edges curling as it went stale. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out, but I couldn't eat it either. It felt like a reminder of what I'd lost, of the love I'd poured into this family that they no longer wanted. I'd catch glimpses of myself in the hall mirror, Gray hair pulled back, eyes tired, shoulders hunched, and I'd look away. I didn't recognize that woman, the one who moved like a shadow, who spoke in whispers to avoid being noticed. Loneliness is a strange thing. It's not just the absence of people. It's the absence of yourself. I felt like I was disappearing, like the Eleanor who'd laughed with Robert, who danced with Michael in the living room when he was small, who taught Lily how to braid her hair, that Eleanor was slipping away. I stopped going to church on Sundays because I couldn't face the pity in people's eyes, the way they'd ask, "How's the family, Ellie?" with that knowing tilt of their heads. I stopped calling my old friend Margaret, who'd been my neighbor for 20 years, because I was ashamed to admit how things had turned out. I didn't want to say it out loud. My son doesn't want me. My grandchildren don't need me. I'm a burden. But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the confusion, the way I kept turning Claire's words over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Had I really become useless? Had I been so busy grieving Robert, so busy trying to hold this family together, that I'd stopped being someone worth keeping? I'd lie awake at night, replaying every moment of the last 3 years, searching for the moment I'd failed. Was it when I stopped working part-time at the library after Robert died? Was it when I let Claire take over the master bedroom? Was it when I didn't fight back, when I let myself shrink to fit their lives? The questions gnawed at me, and I had no answers. One morning, about a week after that day in the kitchen, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I needed air, needed to feel something other than this ache. I pulled on my old coat, the one Robert used to tease me about, saying it made me look like a librarian from the 1940s, and slipped out the back door. I didn't have a plan, just a need to move to prove I could still put one foot in front of the other. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when the kids are at school and the workday's in full swing. I walked past the hardware store, keeping my head down so Michael wouldn't see me through the window. I walked past the church, the bakery, the park where I used to push Lily on the swings. I kept going until I reached the edge of town where the road turns to gravel and the fields stretch out golden under the October sky. That's where I met Ruth. She was sitting on a bench by the old mill, a sketch pad in her lap, her hands moving slowly as she drew the outline of the trees. Ruth was new to town, a retired art teacher who'd moved here after her husband passed. I'd seen her at the market a few times, always with a bright scarf and a smile that felt like it could warm you from the inside. I didn't mean to stop, but she looked up and waved like she'd been expecting me. "Eleanor, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft but sure. I nodded, surprised she knew my name. "Come sit," she said, patting the bench. "The light's too pretty to waste." I don't know why I sat down. Maybe it was her voice or the way she didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She just kept sketching her pencil, scratching softly, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. We didn't talk much at first. She told me about the mill, how it used to be the heart of the town, how she liked drawing things that had stories. I listened, and something in me loosened like a knot starting to unravel. After a while, she looked at me, her eyes kind but sharp, like she could see right through the fog I was carrying. "You look like you're carrying a heavy load," she said. Not a question, just a statement like she already knew. I didn't mean to tell her anything. I'd spent so long keeping it all inside, swallowing the hurt so it wouldn't spill out. But sitting there with the wind rustling the leaves and Ruth's pencil moving steady, I started talking. I told her about Claire's words, about Michael's silence, about the way my own house felt like a stranger's. I told her how I felt invisible, how I didn't know who I was anymore. My voice cracked and I stopped embarrassed, but Ruth just nodded like she'd heard it all before. "People can be cruel when they're scared," she said. "Doesn't make it right, but it's true. They push you away because they don't know how to hold you close." Her words stayed with me, circling in my mind as I walked home. I didn't know if Claire was scared or if Michael was, but I knew Ruth was right about one thing: it wasn't right. I'd spent my life loving this family, giving them everything, and I deserved better than to be pushed away. That night, I did something small, something that felt foolish at the time. I took Robert's old watch from the drawer where I'd kept it since he died. It was a simple thing, silver with a worn leather strap, the kind of watch a man like Robert would wear, practical, unpretentious. I slipped it onto my wrist, the weight of it familiar like his hand on mine. I looked at it, at the hand still ticking after all these years, and I felt a spark, that same quiet anger I'd felt the night Claire's words broke me. It wasn't much, but it was something. A reminder that I was still here, still Eleanor. The next day, I went back to the mill. Ruth was there again sketching, and she smiled when she saw me. We didn't talk about Claire or Michael. Instead, she handed me a pencil and a piece of paper and told me to draw something, anything. I laughed, said I hadn't drawn since I was a girl, but she insisted. So I tried sketching the outline of the mill, my lines shaky and uneven. It was terrible, but it felt good, like I was making something, like I was more than a shadow. Ruth looked at my drawing and nodded like it was a masterpiece. "You've got a good eye," she said. "You just need to trust it." That week I kept going back to the mill. I'd sit with Ruth, draw a little, talk a little. She never pushed, never asked more than I was ready to give. But being there with her with the pencil in my hand, I started to feel like myself again, not the Eleanor I'd been, but someone new, someone who could still learn, still create. I started noticing things, the way the light hit the fields, the way Ruth's laugh sounded like music, the way my own hands, wrinkled and worn, could still hold a pencil, steady if I tried. I wasn't ready to fight, not yet. I wasn't ready to face Claire or Michael or the life that had turned its back on me, but I was starting to remember who I was, and that was enough to keep me going. At home, I kept wearing Robert's watch. Claire noticed it one day, her eyes narrowing as she set the table for dinner. "That's an odd choice," she said, her voice clipped. I didn't answer, just smiled and kept setting out the napkins. It was a small thing, but it felt like defiance, like I was claiming a piece of myself back. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't done. Not with this house, not with this family, not with myself. I didn't know how, but I was going to find my place again. And no one, not Claire, not Michael, was going to take that from me. The weeks that followed felt like I was learning to walk again, each step, tentative each one, a quiet act of defiance against the weight of Claire's words. I'd wake up in the guest room, the one with the lumpy mattress and the window that rattled in the wind, and I'd lie there listening to the house stir. The clatter of dishes, the kids' chatter, Claire's sharp voice directing the morning chaos. It was all so familiar, yet so distant. I used to be the one at the heart of it, pouring cereal, tying shoelaces, sending everyone off with a kiss. Now I waited until the house was empty before I ventured downstairs, moving like a ghost through rooms that no longer felt like mine. I'd make a cup of tea, sit at the kitchen table, and stare at the chair where Robert used to read the paper, his glasses slipping down his nose. I missed him fiercely, not just his presence, but the way he made me feel seen, needed whole. Claire's words, useless, had burrowed deep, and I couldn't shake them. They followed me through the day, whispering in the quiet moments, making me question everything I'd ever done. Had I been enough for Robert? For Michael? For this family I'd poured my life into, I'd always thought love was enough, that if you gave it freely, it would come back to you. But now I wasn't so sure. Michael's silence that day in the kitchen haunted me more than Claire's cruelty. He was my son. My boy, the one I'd carried through sleepless nights, the one I'd taught to ride a bike, to say please and thank you. How could he stand there and let her say those things? How could he look away like I was nothing? I stopped trying to be part of their lives. I stopped offering to help with the kids' homework, stopped cooking dinners, stopped asking Michael about his day. It wasn't out of spite, but survival. Every time I tried to step back into the family, I felt Claire's eyes on me, judging, dismissing. She'd taken over the house, rearranging my things, erasing the traces of Robert and me. The curtains I'd sewn were gone, replaced with sleek blinds. The photo of Robert and me on our wedding day, the one that used to sit on the mantel, was now tucked away in a drawer. I found it one day while looking for a pen, and the sight of it hidden forgotten made my chest ache. I took it back to my room, propped it on the nightstand, and every night I'd look at Robert's smile, his arm around me, and I'd whisper, "I'm still here, love. I'm trying." But trying was hard when I felt so alone. I'd stopped going to the places that used to anchor me, the library where I'd worked, the church, where I'd sung in the choir, the diner where Margaret and I used to share coffee and gossip. I couldn't face the questions, the pity, the way people would look at me like I was a broken thing. I felt like I was shrinking, like the world was closing in, and I didn't know how to stop it. Some days I'd sit in my room for hours, Robert's watch on my wrist, turning it over in my hands, tracing the scratches on its face. It was a piece of him, a piece of us, and it grounded me, reminded me that I'd been loved once, that I'd been strong. Ruth became my lifeline. I'd go to the mill almost every day, walking the long way through town to avoid the hardware store, my coat pulled tight against the chill. She'd be there sketching her scarf bright against the gray of the autumn sky. We didn't always talk, but her presence was enough. She had a way of making you feel like you mattered, like your silences were as important as your words. One day, she handed me a small sketchbook bound in soft leather with a pencil tucked into the spine. "For you," she said, her eyes crinkling. "You don't have to be good at it. Just let it be yours." I took it embarrassed but touched. That night I opened it, staring at the blank pages, feeling foolish. I wasn't an artist. I was just Eleanor, a widow, a mother who'd lost her place. But I picked up the pencil and started to draw a clumsy outline of the oak tree in the backyard, the one Robert and I had planted when Michael was born. It was terrible, all crooked lines and uneven shapes, but it felt like something, like I was creating, not just existing. I showed it to Ruth the next day, and she studied it like it was a museum piece. "You've got heart in this," she said. "That's what matters." Ruth didn't just give me a sketchbook. She gave me permission to be more than Claire's words, more than Michael's silence. We'd sit by the mill drawing or talking, and she'd tell me stories about her husband who'd been a painter, about her years teaching kids who thought they couldn't create, about the way loss had shaped her but hadn't broken her. "You don't stop being you just because someone else can't see it," she said one day, her voice firm. "You're still Eleanor. You decide what that means." Her words were like a seed, small but stubborn, taking root in the cracked soil of my heart. I started to notice things again, things I'd stopped seeing in my fog of hurt. The way the light shifted through the trees at dusk, painting the world gold. The way Lily's laugh echoed in the yard so much, like Michael's when he was small. The way my hands, lined and spotted with age, could still hold a pencil, still plant, a seed, still fold a blanket with care. I wasn't ready to forgive Claire, or Michael wasn't ready to step back into the family like nothing had happened, but I was starting to see myself differently, not as useless, but as someone who could still grow, still matter. At home, I kept wearing Robert's watch, and I stopped hiding the small things that made me me. I put my mother's old teapot back on the stove, the one Claire had shoved into a cupboard. I started playing the radio again softly when I was alone in the kitchen, humming along to the songs Robert and I used to dance to. Claire noticed, of course. One evening, she walked in while I was washing dishes, the radio playing a soft jazz tune. She frowned, her lips tightening. "That's loud," she said, reaching to turn it off. I stopped her, my hand gentle but firm on hers. "I like it," I said, my voice steady. She stared at me, surprised, then walked away without a word. It was a small victory, but it felt like a mountain. I started talking to Lily and Ben again, not as their grandmother who'd been pushed aside, but as someone who had stories to share. One night, when Claire was out and Michael was working late, I found Lily in the living room curled up with a book. I sat beside her, asked what she was reading, and when she told me about a girl who ran away to find a lost kingdom, I told her about the time Robert and I got lost on a camping trip, how we'd laughed until we cried, finding our way by the stars. Lily's eyes lit up, and for a moment I felt like I was hers again, like I was enough. These were small things, drawing in a sketchbook, wearing a watch, playing the radio, telling a story, but they were building something inside me. A quiet strength, a sense that I wasn't done, that I could still claim my place in this world. I thought about Ruth, about her sketches, her stories, her refusal to let loss define her. I thought about Robert, about the way he'd believed in me, even when I doubted myself. And I thought about myself, about the woman I'd been, the woman I could still be. One afternoon, as I sat with Ruth by the mill, she handed me a postcard. She'd painted a tiny scene of the fields at sunset, all warm golds and deep purples. "Keep this," she said, "a reminder that beauty doesn't fade, not if you know where to look." I tucked it into my sketchbook, and that night I taped it to my mirror right next to Robert's photo. I looked at it at the watch on my wrist, at the sketchbook on my nightstand, and I felt that spark again, stronger now, like a fire that had found its fuel. I didn't know what was coming, didn't know how I'd face Claire or Michael or the family that had turned its back on me. But I knew I wasn't invisible anymore. I was Eleanor, and I was starting to remember what that meant. The spark inside me, the one that had flickered to life with Ruth's kindness and Robert's watch on my wrist, began to grow steadier, like a candle finding its flame in a drafty room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, not the kind of strength that shouts or demands attention. It was quiet, rooted, the kind that comes from knowing you've survived worse and can survive this too. I was still living in a house that felt like it belonged to someone else, still navigating the sharp edges of Claire's disdain and Michael's indifference, but I was starting to carve out a space for myself, a place where I could be Eleanor again, not the mother they'd forgotten, not the widow they pitied, but me. I kept going to the mill, my walks with Ruth becoming the anchor of my days. We'd sit on that bench, sketching the world around us, the curve of the river, the gnarled branches of the old oak, the way the clouds softened the sky. My drawings were still clumsy, but they were mine. Each line, a small act of creation, a reminder that I could still make something beautiful. Ruth taught me to see differently, to notice the details, the way light caught on a blade of grass, the way shadows pooled under the mill's wheel. "It's not about perfection," she'd say, her pencil, moving with a grace I envied. "It's about what you choose to see." And slowly, I was choosing to see myself. At home, I stopped tiptoeing. I'd spent months moving through the house like an intruder, afraid to disturb Claire's carefully curated order. But now I claimed small pieces of it back. I hung a photo of Robert and me in the hallway, the one from our 25th anniversary where we're laughing under a willow tree, his arms slung around my shoulders. Claire noticed it the next day, her lips pursing as she passed, but she didn't say anything. I didn't care if she did. That photo was my history, my love, my life, and I wasn't hiding it anymore. I started cooking again, not the elaborate dinners I used to make, but simple things. Oatmeal cookies for the kids, a pot of soup for myself. The kitchen smelled like home again, like the days when Robert would sneak a taste from the pot, grinning like a boy. Lily and Ben started to notice the change. One afternoon, I found Ben in the backyard kicking a soccer ball against the fence. I sat on the porch steps watching him, and when he missed a shot, I called out, "Keep your eyes on the ball, not your feet." He looked surprised, then grinned and tried again. Later, he sat beside me, sweaty and breathless, and asked about the time Robert taught me to play catch. I told him the story, how I'd been terrible, how Robert had laughed so hard he'd fallen over in the grass. Ben laughed too, and for a moment I felt like his grandmother again, not a stranger in his world. Lily was harder to reach. She was 12, caught in that space between childhood and something else, her eyes always on her phone or her friends. But one evening when Claire was out and Michael was at the store, I found her in the living room sketching in a notebook. I recognized the focus in her hands, the same focus I felt when I drew with Ruth. I sat beside her, not too close, and asked what she was drawing. She hesitated, then showed me a girl with wings soaring over a forest. "It's for a story I'm writing," she said, her voice shy. I told her about my sketchbook about the mill and Ruth, and her eyes lit up. "Can I see?" she asked. I brought it down from my room and we sat there flipping through my awkward drawings, laughing at the wonky trees and lopsided birds. It wasn't much, but it was a bridge, a way back to her. These moments with the kids, with my sketchbook, with the house, were building something inside me, a foundation maybe, or a map to find my way back to myself. But it wasn't just emotional. I started thinking about my life, about the practical things I'd let slip since Robert died. I'd always been the one to balance the checkbook to make sure the bills were paid, but after his death, I'd handed so much over to Michael and Claire thinking they'd take care of it, thinking they'd take care of me. Now I wasn't so sure. I started looking at the paperwork, the bank statements, the deeds tucked away in the safe. This house, the one Claire treated like her own, was still in my name. The loan we'd given Michael for the hardware store, the one he'd never repaid, was still on the books. I didn't know what it meant, yet didn't know how it fit into the life I was trying to rebuild, but it felt important, like a key I'd forgotten I held. One day, I went to the bank, something I hadn't done in years. I'd always hated banks the way they made you feel small, but I put on my best dress, the blue one Robert always said, brought out my eyes and walked in with my head high. I asked to see the account details, the ones tied to the house and the store. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, walked me through it, explaining balances, interest liens. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. The house was mine, free and clear, and the store, Michael's pride and joy, was still tied to the loan we'd given him. I thanked her, took the papers home and tucked them into my nightstand next to Robert's watch and Ruth's postcard. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them, but they felt like power, like a piece of myself I'd forgotten. Ruth noticed the change in me. One afternoon at the mill as we sketched the river's curve, she put down her pencil and looked at me. "You're standing taller," she said, her voice warm, "like you're remembering who you are." I smiled, surprised she could see it. I told her about the bank, about the papers, about the way I'd started cooking and talking to the kids. She nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're not just surviving, Eleanor," she said. "You're growing, and that's a beautiful thing. Growing." The words stayed with me like a song I couldn't stop humming. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard, the one Robert and I had planted when Michael was born. It had been a sapling then, fragile and thin, but now it was tall, its branches reaching for the sky. I'd tended it through storms, through drought, through years when I thought it might not make it. And it had grown not because it was loud or showy, but because it was stubborn, because it kept reaching for the light. Maybe I was like that tree, still growing, still reaching, even after everything. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a box of old letters from the closet, the ones Robert had written me when we were young, when he was working on the railroad and I was teaching school. I sat on my bed, Robert's watch, ticking on my wrist, and read them one by one. His words were simple, full of love and hope, full of belief in me. "You're my home, Ellie." He'd written in one, his handwriting messy, but sure. "No matter where I go, you're my home." I cried, then not the hollow tears of loss, but the kind that come from remembering what you're made of. I folded the letters carefully, placed them back in the box, and made a decision. I wasn't going to let Claire's words define me. I wasn't going to let Michael's silence erase me. I was going to keep growing, keep reaching, keep claiming my place. The next day, I went to the backyard and dug a small hole near the oak tree. I planted a handful of daffodil bulbs, the ones Robert used to call sunshine, in the dirt. I didn't know if they'd grow, didn't know if I'd be here to see them bloom. But I planted them anyway, my hands deep in the earth, the watch heavy on my wrist. It felt like a promise, not just to myself, but to Robert, to the life we'd built, to the woman I was becoming. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, and looked at the tree, its leaves rustling in the wind. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't useless. I was Eleanor, and I was still here, still growing, still alive. The daffodil bulbs I'd planted by the oak tree became a kind of touchstone for me, a quiet reminder that growth doesn't always show itself right away. Beneath the earth, those bulbs were working, reaching even if no one could see it. I felt like that too, working in the dark, building something new inside myself, even as the world around me stayed cold. The house was still Claire's domain with her sleek furniture and her sharp rules, but I was learning to move through it differently, to carry myself with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't loud about it, wasn't confrontational. I didn't need to be. My strength was in the small things, the way I held my head up, the way I claimed my space, the way I refused to let Claire's words sink any deeper. I kept sketching with Ruth our afternoons by the mill, becoming a ritual I leaned into like a prayer. My drawings were getting better, not masterful, but truer. I could capture the bend of a branch, now the ripple of the river, the way the light softened at dusk. Ruth said it was because I was seeing more clearly not just the world, but myself. "You're letting your heart guide your hand," she said one day, her eyes crinkling as she studied my sketch of the mill's wheel. I didn't know if that was true, but I knew I felt different when I drew alive, present, like I was more than the sum of my hurts. At home, I kept reclaiming pieces of myself. I started wearing my old dresses again, the ones I'd tucked away because Claire had once said they were dated. I'd always loved the way they felt, soft cotton with simple lines, the kind of dresses that made me think of the girl I'd been when Robert and I were young. I'd catch Claire's glance sometimes, her eyebrows lifting as she took in the floral print or the hem that brushed my knees, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't dressing for her approval. I was dressing for me, for the woman who'd danced with Robert in the backyard, who'd laughed until her sides ached, who'd built a life from scratch. Lily and Ben were my allies, even if they didn't know it. I found ways to connect with them, quiet moments that felt like stealing back the family I'd lost. With Ben, it was soccer in the backyard, me cheering as he practiced his kicks, telling him stories about Robert's days as a high school pitcher. With Lily, it was drawing. She'd started joining me in my room sometimes, her sketchbook open beside mine, and we'd work in silence, the scratch of our pencils, a kind of conversation. One night, she showed me a drawing of a girl standing in a field, her wings folded but ready to fly. "She's you." Lily said, her voice soft, and my throat tightened. I hugged her, and for the first time in months, I felt like her grandmother, not a stranger. But Michael and Claire were another story. Michael was a ghost in his own way, always at the store or buried in his phone, avoiding my eyes. I'd catch glimpses of the boy he'd been, his quick smile, the way he'd hum when he was distracted. But they were fleeting, buried under the weight of whatever had changed him. Claire, though, was a constant presence, her voice sharp, her gaze sharper. She didn't say useless again, but she didn't need to. It was in the way she corrected me when I set the table, the way she sighed when I left my sketchbook on the counter, the way she talked over me when I tried to join a conversation. I didn't argue, didn't snap back. I just watched, and I waited, and I kept building that quiet strength inside me. I started taking stock of my life in ways I hadn't before. The papers from the bank, the ones I'd tucked away, became a project. I'd sit in my room at night, Robert's watch ticking on my wrist, and go through them, piecing together the story they told. The house was mine, paid off years ago with the savings Robert and I had scraped together. The hardware store, Michael's pride, was still tied to the loan we'd given him, a loan he'd never repaid, never even acknowledged. I found other things, too. Savings accounts I'd forgotten, about a small investment Robert had made in a local business, a life insurance policy that had been sitting untouched. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I'd realized, more than Claire or Michael knew about. I didn't tell them. I wasn't ready to show my hand, not yet. But knowing it was there, knowing I had options, felt like armor. I started making plans, small ones at first. I called Margaret, my old friend from the library, and we met for coffee at the diner the first time I'd gone out socially in months. I was nervous, afraid she'd see how broken I'd been, but she just hugged me and said, "You look like you're coming back to life, Ellie." We talked for hours about her grandkids, about the town, about the years we'd spent together. I didn't tell her everything didn't mention Claire's words or Michael's silence, but I told her about Ruth, about my sketches, about the daffodils I'd planted. She listened, her eyes warm, and when we parted, she squeezed my hand and said, "You're stronger than you know." I carried those words home, let them settle next to Ruth's, next to Robert's, next to my own. I started volunteering at the library again just a few hours a week. It was Margaret's idea, and at first I hesitated, afraid I'd be out of place, a relic in a world that had moved on. But the moment I stepped through the doors, the smell of books and the quiet hum of the place wrapped around me like a hug. I organized shelves, helped kids find stories read to the preschool group on Thursdays. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a piece of the world where I wasn't useless, where I was needed. The kids called me Miss Ellie, their voices bright, and the parents smiled, thanking me for my time. I'd walk home afterward, my steps lighter, Robert's watch glinting in the sun, and I'd feel like I was growing, not just surviving. One day I did something bolder. I went to the hardware store not to see Michael, but to talk to his accountant, a man named Tom, who'd known Robert and me for years. I'd called ahead, made an appointment, and when I walked in, Tom greeted me like an old friend. I asked about the store, about the loan, about the financials. He was kind, patient, explaining things I hadn't thought to ask before. The store was doing well, he said, but it was still leaning on the loan we'd given, still tied to the collateral we'd put up our house, our savings. I nodded, thanked him, and left before Michael could see me. I didn't know what I'd do with the information, but it felt like another key, another piece of the puzzle I was building. That night, I sat in my room, the papers spread out on the bed, Robert's letters beside them. I read one, his words steady and sure. "You're my rock, Ellie. Always will be." I closed my eyes, picturing his face, his smile, the way he'd believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I thought about the daffodils buried in the cold earth, waiting for spring. I thought about lilies drawing the girl with wings ready to fly. And I thought about myself, about the woman I'd been, the woman I was becoming. I wasn't useless. I wasn't invisible. I was Eleanor, and I was starting to see what that could mean. I took a symbolic step that night, something that felt both small and enormous. I went to the closet and pulled out Robert's old flannel shirt, the one he'd worn when he worked in the yard, the one that still smelled faintly of him, of sawdust and earth. I slipped it on over my dress, the sleeves too long, the fabric soft against my skin. I looked in the mirror at the watch on my wrist, the shirt hanging loose, the postcard taped to the frame, and I smiled. It wasn't a loud smile, not a triumphant one. It was quiet, steady, the kind that comes from knowing you're still here, still fighting, still growing. The next morning, I wore the shirt to the mill, and Ruth laughed when she saw it, a warm, knowing laugh. "That's the spirit," she said, handing me a new pencil sharper than the last. We sketched until the sun dipped low, and as I walked home, the flannel soft against my skin, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just reclaiming my dignity. I was claiming my power, my place, my life. And I knew deep down that I was ready for whatever came next. Wearing Robert's flannel shirt that day at the mill felt like slipping into my own skin again, like I was stitching together the pieces of myself that had frayed over the past months. It wasn't just the shirt, though it carried his scent, his memory in every thread. It was the choice to wear it, to let it hang loose over my dress, to walk through town with my head up, knowing Claire might see, knowing she might judge. I didn't care. I was done shrinking. Done letting her words useless define the shape of my days. I was Eleanor, and I was growing not just in the quiet moments with Ruth or the small victories with Lily and Ben, but in the deeper, unspoken ways that come from deciding you're worth fighting for. My afternoons at the mill with Ruth had become more than a ritual, they were a reclamation. We'd sit by the river, sketching the world as it unfolded, the way the water caught the light, the way the grasses bent in the wind, the way the mill's wheel turned steady and sure. My drawings were steadier now, too, the lines less hesitant, the shapes more true. I'd started sketching things from memory. Robert's hands calloused and gentle, holding a hammer. The oak tree in the backyard, its branches reaching like arms. Lily's face, her eyes bright with a story she hadn't yet told. Ruth would watch me work her own pencil, moving in that graceful way of hers, and she'd nod like she could see the change in me, like she knew what it meant. "You're not just drawing," she said one day, her voice soft but certain. "You're telling your story." Her words stayed with me, circling in my mind as I walked home, Robert's watch ticking on my wrist, the flannel shirt brushing my thighs. My story. I'd spent so long living for others, Robert, Michael, the kids, that I'd forgotten I had a story of my own, one that didn't end when Robert died, one that didn't stop when Claire called me useless. I was writing it now in the sketches and the daffodils I'd planted, in the way I was starting to move through the world. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was mine, and it was enough. At home, I kept claiming my space not with arguments or demands, but with quiet insistence. I brought my mother's old quilt out of storage, the one she'd pieced together when I was a girl, its patches faded, but warm. I draped it over the couch in the living room, right where Claire's sleek throw blanket used to sit. She noticed it that evening, her lips tightening as she passed, but she didn't touch it. I started playing the radio again, not just when I was alone, but during dinner, letting the soft jazz fill the room. Claire would glance at me, her fork pausing, but I'd meet her eyes and smile steady and calm. It wasn't about defiance, not really. It was about being me, about refusing to apologize for it. Lily and Ben were my anchors, their presence a reminder that not all of my family had turned away. Ben would find me in the backyard now, kicking his soccer ball, asking for stories about Robert or the town, or the time I'd tried to ride a horse and ended up in a ditch. I'd laugh and he'd laugh, and for those moments I felt whole again. Lily was quieter, her world pulling her toward friends and school, but she'd still come to my room sometimes, her sketchbook in hand. We'd draw together, and I'd tell her about the mill, about Ruth, about the way art could hold a piece of your soul. One night she gave me a drawing, a small, careful sketch of me sitting by the oak tree, my face soft but strong. "It's how I see you." She said, her voice barely a whisper. I hugged her tight, my eyes stinging, and I knew I'd never let that drawing go. Michael and Claire, though, were a wall I couldn't breach. Michael was a shadow in the house, always working late, always distracted. I'd try to catch his eye to ask about the store or the kids, but he'd answer in monosyllables, his gaze sliding away. I saw the boy I'd raised in him sometimes, the way he'd rub his neck when he was tired, the way he'd hum under his breath, but he was buried under something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or shame, or just the weight of a life he hadn't planned. Claire was different. Her disdain was a living thing, sharp and deliberate. She didn't call me useless again, but it was in her sighs, her corrections, the way she'd talk about her house, her family, as if I were a guest who'd overstayed. I didn't fight her. I didn't need to. I was building something stronger than her words, something she couldn't touch. The papers in my nightstand, the bank statements, the deed, the loan agreement became a kind of map, guiding me toward a future I was only starting to imagine. I'd sit with them at night, Robert's letters open beside me, and I'd trace the numbers, the dates, the promises written in ink. The house was mine, a truth that felt like a shield. The loan for the hardware store, still unpaid, was a thread tying Michael's success to Robert and me. I started making calls, quiet ones, to the bank, to Tom the accountant, to a lawyer friend of Margaret's named Susan. I didn't tell them everything, just enough to understand my options. Susan was kind, her voice calm as she explained terms like equity and collateral and rights. I listened, took notes, and felt a quiet power growing inside me, the kind that comes from knowing you're not helpless. I started saving too, tucking away small amounts from the library, volunteering from the interest on Robert's old investment. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a nest egg for a future I was beginning to dream about. I didn't know what it would look like. Maybe a small apartment in town, maybe a trip to see the ocean, something Robert and I had always talked about but never done. The dream was vague, but it was enough to keep me moving, to keep me planning. I bought a journal, a simple one with a blue cover, and started writing in it not just sketches now, but words. Thoughts, memories, hopes. I wrote about Robert, about the way he'd made me feel like I could do anything. I wrote about Lily and Ben, about the love I still had for them, even through the hurt. I wrote about myself, about the woman I was becoming strong in a way I hadn't expected. One afternoon, I took a bold step, one that felt both terrifying and right. I went to the town hall and asked about the community garden, a project I'd heard about at the library. They were looking for volunteers to tend plots to grow flowers and vegetables for the food bank. I signed up not because I was a gardener, but because I wanted to be part of something, to put my hands in the earth and watch something grow. The first day I showed up in Robert's flannel shirt, my hair tied back, and I worked alongside strangers who became friends, old farmers, young mothers, kids who reminded me of Ben. We planted seeds, pulled weeds, laughed under the sun. I felt alive, needed, like I was part of the world again. That night, I came home with dirt under my nails and an ache in my back, but I was smiling. Claire was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, and she looked at me, her eyes narrowing at the flannel. The dirt, the quiet joy I couldn't hide. "Been busy?" she asked. Her voice clipped. I nodded, setting my journal on the counter. "Planting," I said, and left it at that. She didn't ask more, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the unease, like she could sense something shifting. I didn't need her to understand. I was doing this for me, for the daffodils still waiting under the earth for the story I was writing with every step. I kept one more symbolic act that week, something small but heavy with meaning. I took Robert's old toolbox from the garage, the one he'd used for every project in the house, and brought it to my room. I opened it, the hinges creaking, and ran my hands over the tools, the hammer, the screwdriver, the level he'd used to hang our shelves. I didn't know what I'd do with them, but they felt like a promise, like a piece of him saying, "Build something, Ellie." I closed the toolbox and set it by my bed next to the journal, the papers, the watch. I looked at them, at the quilt on the couch, the drawing Lily had given me, and I knew I was ready for the next step, whatever it was. I was Eleanor, and I was building not just a life, but a legacy, one that no one could take away. The air in the house had changed, though I couldn't say exactly when it happened. It wasn't something you could point to, like a new piece of furniture or a different routine. It was subtler. A shift in the way the rooms felt when I walked through them, the way Claire's eyes lingered on me a moment longer than before, the way Michael's shoulders tensed when I spoke. I'd been growing quietly, steadily, like the daffodils I'd planted their green tips, just starting to peek through the soil by the oak tree. I hadn't set out to unsettle anyone, but my presence, my refusal to disappear, was doing it anyway. I was Eleanor, and I was done being invisible. I kept up my routines, the ones that had become my lifeline. Afternoons with Ruth at the mill, sketching the world and myself into sharper focus. Mornings at the community garden, my hands in the dirt, planting carrots and marigolds, alongside people who called me Ellie and valued my work. Evenings with Lily and Ben, sharing stories, drawings, moments that felt like reclaiming my place as their grandmother. I wore Robert's flannel shirt often now, its weight a comfort, and his watch never left my wrist. The toolbox sat by my bed, a quiet promise, and my journal filled with words, memories, plans, dreams I hadn't dared to dream in years. I was building something not just for me, but for the woman I wanted to be, the legacy I wanted to leave. The papers in my nightstand, the deed, the loan agreement, the bank statements were no longer just a secret. They were a plan, one I'd been shaping with Susan, the lawyer friend of Margaret's. We'd met a few times, always at the diner over coffee, where no one would think twice about two older women talking. Susan was patient, her voice calm as she walked me through my options. The house was mine, she confirmed, untouchable unless I chose to let it go. The loan for Michael's hardware store, still unpaid, gave me leverage more than I'd realized. "You have power here, Eleanor," Susan said, her eyes steady. "It's up to you how to use it." I didn't want revenge, didn't want to hurt anyone. But I wanted respect, wanted my place, wanted to be seen. And I was starting to see how I could make that happen. The moment came unexpectedly on a Saturday in early spring, when the air was soft and the daffodils by the oak tree were blooming, their yellow heads bright against the earth. Claire had planned a family gathering, something she'd been talking about for weeks, a barbecue to celebrate the hardware store's 10th anniversary. She'd invited half the town, it seemed, along with Michael's employees, their families, and a few of her own relatives. I wasn't included in the planning, wasn't asked to help. Claire had made that clear, saying, "You don't need to worry about it, Eleanor. We've got it handled." I'd nodded, smiled, and let her think I was stepping back. But I had my own plans, ones she couldn't imagine. The day of the barbecue, the backyard was transformed. Claire had strung fairy lights in the trees, set up tables with crisp white cloths, arranged platters of food that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The kids ran around laughing while Michael manned the grill, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Neighbors milled about, their voices warm with chatter, and Claire moved through the crowd, her smile bright, her dress perfect. It was her stage, her moment, and she played it well. I stayed on the porch at first, watching my flannel shirt tucked into a pair of slacks, Robert's watch glinting in the sunlight. I could have stayed there quiet, unnoticed, but something in me, the same spark that had kept me going all these months, said it was time. I'd asked Susan to come, and she arrived just as the party was in full swing, her briefcase tucked under her arm. I'd also invited Tom the accountant and a few others from the bank who knew the store's history. They weren't here to make a scene, just to bear witness. I waited until Claire called everyone to attention, her voice ringing out as she thanked them for coming, for supporting our family's business. She talked about Michael's hard work, about the store's success, about the future they were building. Michael stood beside her, smiling, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who'd dreamed big and worked hard. But I also saw the man who'd let me fade, who'd stood silent when Claire called me useless. I stepped forward, my heart steady, my voice clear. "I'd like to say a few words," I said loud enough to carry over the crowd. Claire's smile faltered, but she nodded, stepping aside. I walked to the center of the yard near the oak tree, the daffodils at my feet. Everyone turned to me, their faces curious, some surprised. I took a breath, feeling Robert's watch on my wrist, his flannel against my skin, his love in my bones. This store I began means so much to this family, to this town. But it didn't start with Michael alone. It started with my husband Robert and me. We believed in Michael's dream, believed in him, so we gave him a loan to start this business, a loan that's still on the books, still tied to this house, to the life we built. I paused, letting the words settle. Claire's face went pale, her eyes darting to Michael, who looked like he'd been struck. "This house," I continued, "the one we're standing in, the one Robert and I paid for with years of hard work, is still in my name. It's not just a house, it's a home, a legacy, a promise. And I've decided it's time to honor that promise." The crowd was silent, their eyes on me, some wide with shock, others soft with understanding. I looked at Claire, at Michael, and I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse. I didn't need to. The truth was enough. "I've been called useless," I said, my voice steady. "Told I don't belong, that I'm a burden. But I'm not useless. I'm Eleanor Roberts' wife, Michael's mother, Lily and Ben's grandmother. I built this family, this home, this business, and I'm not done building." I nodded to Susan, who stepped forward, her briefcase open. "I've spoken with my lawyer," I said, "and I'm making some changes. The loan for the store will be called in unless Michael and Claire agree to new terms that respect the history of this family, that respect me. The house stays in my name, and I'll decide its future not as a burden, but as a gift." I looked at Lily and Ben standing near the edge of the crowd, their faces a mix of awe and confusion. "This is for you," I said to them, And for the family, we can still be if we choose to be. The yard was so quiet you could hear the wind in the trees. Claire's hands were clenched her face, a mask of shock and anger. Michael stared at me, his eyes wet, his mouth opening but no words coming out. I didn't wait for them to speak. I turned to the crowd, my voice softer now. Thank you for being here, for being part of this town, this story. Let's celebrate what we've built together and what we can still build. I stepped back, my heart pounding but steady, and the crowd erupted in murmurs, some clapping, others whispering. Susan and Tom stayed close, answering questions from neighbors, explaining the legalities in quiet tones. Claire pulled Michael aside, her voice low and urgent, but I didn't listen. I walked to the oak tree, knelt by the daffodils, and touched their petals soft and bright. Lily came to me, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. "Grandma." She said, her voice small, "Are you leaving?" I smiled, took her hand. "No, sweetheart. I'm staying. I'm just making sure I'm seen." That night, after the guests had gone, Michael came to my room. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his face drawn. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to fix it." I looked at him. My son, my boy. And I saw the weight he carried, the guilt, the love he'd buried. "You can start now," I said, not harsh but firm. "We can start now." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and left without another word. Claire didn't come, didn't speak, but I didn't need her to. I'd said what I needed to say, and I'd done it with dignity, with strength, with love. I sat on my bed, Robert's toolbox, open his letters beside me, and I felt peace, not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from knowing you've honored yourself. I was Eleanor, and I had spoken my truth, not with anger, but with power. And in that moment, I knew I was enough. The days after the barbecue felt different, like the air had cleared after a long storm. The house was quieter, not with the heavy silence of avoidance, but with a kind of stillness that comes when truths have been spoken and the dust is settling. Claire didn't speak to me for days, her movements sharp and clipped her eyes, avoiding mine. Michael was different, tentative like a man stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He'd linger in the kitchen some mornings, pouring his coffee slowly, as if waiting for a chance to say something. I didn't push him. I'd said my piece under the oak tree in front of the town, in front of the daffodils, and I'd meant every word. The rest was up to him, to them, to the family we might still become. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living fully for myself. I kept my routines, the ones that had carried me through the fog and into this new light. I went to the mill with Ruth, our sketches now filling pages with the story of spring, the river's sparkle, the new leaves on the trees, the way the world seemed to breathe again. Ruth didn't ask about the barbecue, didn't pry, but I told her anyway over tea one afternoon, the words spilling out like a river, finding its course. She listened, her eyes warm, and when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, Eleanor," she said. "You stood up for every woman who's ever been told she's less than she is." Her words settled in me deep and true, and I carried them home like a gift. The community garden became my sanctuary, a place where I could dig, plant, grow. The marigolds were blooming now, their orange and yellow heads bright against the earth, and the carrots we'd planted were starting to show their green tops poking through the soil. I'd work there with the others, old farmers with weathered hands, young mothers with babies on their hips, kids who laughed as they chased each other through the rows. They called me Ellie, asked my advice, thanked me for my time. I felt needed not as a mother or a grandmother, but as myself, as a woman with something to give. One day I brought Lily and Ben with me, and we planted a row of sunflowers, their seeds heavy with promise. Ben got dirt on his face, and Lily laughed, and I thought, this is what family can be, moments of joy shared and simple. At home, I kept the quilt on the couch, the radio playing softly Robert's photo in the hall. Claire didn't touch them, didn't rearrange or sigh. I didn't know if it was respect or defeat, and I didn't care. I was done measuring my worth by her reactions. Michael started small, his efforts clumsy but real. He'd ask me about the garden, about my sketches, about the library. One evening, he brought home a small frame for Lily's drawing of me, the one with the wings, and hung it in the living room, right where everyone could see. "It belongs here," he said, his voice low, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in months. I knotted my throat tight, and we stood there, not quite whole, but trying. The papers in my nightstand were no longer a secret. Susan had drafted new terms for the loan ones that protected my interests while giving Michael a chance to keep the store. He signed them without protest, his hand shaking slightly as he handed the pen back to Susan. The house stayed in my name, a decision I made not out of spite, but love for Robert, for the life we'd built, for the future I wanted to shape. I started planning not just for myself, but for Lily and Ben. I set up small trust funds, modest, but enough to give them options to let them dream. I didn't tell Claire or Michael. It was between me and the kids, a promise for the days when I wouldn't be here. I didn't forgive Claire, not in the way people talk about forgiveness, like a clean slate or a warm embrace. I didn't hate her either. I saw her now not as a villain, but as a woman carrying her own fears, her own scars lashing out because she didn't know how to hold space for me. I wished her well in my own way, but I didn't need her approval or her love. I had my own. Michael was different. I forgave him not because he deserved it, but because I loved him, because he was my son, because I could see him trying to find his way back. It wasn't perfect, wasn't a storybook ending, but it was real, and that was enough. I kept writing in my journal, the blue one that had become a kind of friend. I wrote about the barbecue, about the way it felt to stand under the oak tree and speak my truth. I wrote about Ruth, about the garden, about the daffodils that had bloomed against all odds. I wrote about Robert, about the love that still lived in me, steady and sure. And I wrote about myself, about the woman I'd become, not the wife or mother or grandmother, but Eleanor whole and enough. The words were my legacy as much as the house or the store or the trust funds. They were proof that I'd lived, that I'd grown, that I'd mattered. One afternoon, I took Lily to the mill, just the two of us. We sat by the river, our sketchbooks open, and I told her about the daffodils, about the oak tree, about the way love can grow even in the hardest ground. I took off Robert's watch, the one I'd worn for months, and placed it in her hands. "This is for you," I said, my voice steady. "Not to keep, but to hold, to remember. Your grandfather believed in me, and I believe in you." Her eyes were wide, her fingers tracing the scratches on the watch's face, and she nodded like she understood. I gave her the postcard Ruth had painted too, the one of the fields at sunset, and I told her to keep it to remember that beauty doesn't fade, not if you know where to look. That night I went to the backyard alone, the air cool and soft. The daffodils were still there, their petals fading, but still bright, still stubborn. I knelt by the oak tree, my hands in the earth, and I planted one last thing, a single bulb, a promise for next spring. I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands, and looked at the house, its windows glowing with light. It was my home, not because of the deed, but because of the love I'd poured into it, the strength I'd found here, the story I'd written. I was at peace not because everything was perfect, but because I was whole. I want you to know something, you who are listening, you who might feel invisible, unwanted, pushed aside. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, by who sees you, by who stays. It's measured by how you choose to honor yourself, by the quiet steps you take, by the love you give, even when it's not returned. You are enough just as you are, and you always will be. I learned that under an oak tree with daffodils at my feet, and I'm telling you now, so you can learn it too. I lit a candle that night, one I'd kept from Robert's in my last anniversary, its wax soft and worn. I set it on the porch, watched its flame flicker in the dark, and I smiled. It was a small light, but it was mine, and it was enough.